my big aha was, hey, here in Silicon Valley, the technology is the business. Every once in a while in the market, there's like a tidal wave. And if you can build a good surfboard and surf on that wave, you can often build a pretty good business. It takes you a while to build a company. You want to sort of build for what the market's going to need in the future, not necessarily what they need right now. How do you really unlock growth? You got to find that hotspot that has urgency. I often get asked, like, how do you create urgency? And if you're asking that question, you're already half in trouble.
You're listening to the EnterpriseReady podcast, a show aiming to change the enterprise software narrative from how to sell to enterprises to how to build for enterprises. We'll interview industry experts and enterprise software founders as we break through the jargon, establish a common vernacular, and share the lessons learned from building the world's best enterprise software. Hi, I'm Grant Miller, creator of EnterpriseReady and founder and CEO of Replicated, where we power the world's best enterprise software. The EnterpriseReady podcast is brought to you by Heavybit, a program dedicated to helping startups take their developer products to market. For more information, visit heavybit.com. If you're interested in being a guest on the show, or if you'd like to suggest a topic, or just learn more about enterprise features, find us at enterpriseready.io. In this episode of the EnterpriseReady podcast, I sit down with Bob Tinker, co-founder of MobileIron, a company that he served as CEO of from founding through IPO before stepping down in 2016. Bob recently co-authored a book called Survival to Thrival, in which he lays out the foundations for building and growing an enterprise software company. We focus on several of the frameworks that Bob developed for building a go-to-market playbook, including how to determine your best go-to-market approach and how to continuously evolve your company in a fast-changing market. We also discuss the importance of customer urgency and playing to your wow features. I think anyone building a modern enterprise software company is really going to appreciate this episode.
All right, Bob, thank you so much for joining us.
Grant, thanks for having me.
Cool, so let's just dive right in. Tell us a little bit about your background.
I'm a three-time entrepreneur, originally an engineer, and my first job out of college was an IT guy at a bank. So I used to be on the customer side and kind of accidentally ended up in sales when I was doing customer support for some large accounts, and the account rep left the bank. I ended up running sales for some large accounts. And I realized that there was sort of a two-class system in business where there were sort of the business people and technology people. It's a little bit less so now, but definitely the case in sort of the 90s in banking. And frankly, that was frustrating because I like technology, I like business. So I moved out to the Bay Area to go to business school. And that was sort of the thesis, to try and be able to participate in both sides. But then I realized it really wasn't going to change things. My big aha was, hey, here in Silicon Valley, the technology is the business. So that was sort of the beginning of my entrepreneurial career. And then fast forward, 3 different startups. First one, voice over IP company. Frankly, that one failed. It was too early.
And was that like a consumer company, or was that an enterprise?
Yeah, it was an enterprise voice over IP in 1998.
Oh, cool. Okay.
Yeah, it was just one of those things where it was too early. And in 2002...
So just too early from the technology perspective? Or?
Technology, market, and actually urgency, right? Like, think about like 1998, 2000, like voice over IP was cool, but like, why would anybody change? Like, there wasn't sort of a compelling event for somebody to rip out their existing voice infrastructure and put in voice over IP. It was one of those things that happened slowly over the course of a 20-year period. But that's a rough place to be a startup.
Yeah. The 20-year startup.
The 20-year sales cycle, it's a rough world. And my second company was an enterprise Wi-Fi company called Airspace, and I was the first business guy there. So I wasn't one of the founders, but I was the first business guy there. And that was a great experience. We went from like 0 to 80 million over 4 years.
And what did you guys do? You say enterprise Wi-Fi?
Enterprise Wi-Fi.
Okay.
So if you remember back 2002, the Centrino chipset first showed up in laptops, and all of a sudden people started trying to use Wi-Fi at work. And the first answer was, let me go to Fry's and get some consumer access points and sprinkle them around the office. And then all of a sudden, large companies were like, we need to figure out how to have Wi-Fi for everyone. And so we sold enterprise Wi-Fi infrastructure. Cisco bought us for $450 million in 2005, and we became the Cisco Wireless business unit.
So you would like go into large enterprises and physically install the routers and the access points and all that?
Yeah, so the big innovation was, how do you move from sort of standalone access points to thinking about Wi-Fi as a system? So we had enterprise Wi-Fi access points, but they were all centrally controlled by basically a wireless controller. So we adopted sort of the cellular architecture model for enterprise Wi-Fi.
Oh, cool.
And that turned out to be both good timing in terms of market urgency, because now Wi-Fi was in laptops and customers needed to do something about it, and we had a solution to do that. And we grew from 0 to 80 million over 4 years. And that was a great growth experience for us.
Well, it kind of relates to what you end up doing next, right?
Right. Another transition, tidal wave, urgency that is sort of forced by a macro shift in the market. The way you can sort of picture it is every once in a while in the market, there's a tidal wave, or it doesn't even have to be a tidal wave, just a wave. And if you can build a good surfboard and surf on that wave, you can often build a pretty good business. And for aerospace, the wave was Wi-Fi showing up at work.
Like Wi-Fi ready devices, and then people
needed Wi-Fi infrastructure to attach it to.
Right. Because it's before that, everything was landline and hardwired, and you sat at a desk and you plugged in, and that's how you got the internet.
Yep. And now all of a sudden, laptops had Wi-Fi, and people wanted to just work wherever they were.
And people were probably just plugging a router on top of their their endpoint,
which was a huge security issue.
Exactly.
Actually, because people were just plugging in consumer access points under their desk.
Right, using their one connection and to make it Wi-Fi so they could walk around with.
They were very popular.
Yeah,
except for with the security team.
Yeah, exactly.
And but that's a great point, that it was a transition or a wave in the market, that if you build a good product to surf on that, you can build a good business.
And then, interestingly, also just driven by the changing employee needs that were they were bringing in technology that they wanted to use and made their lives better, because they didn't have to plug in every meeting, and they could walk around and show people stuff. So that makes a lot of sense.
End user driven demand.
Yeah,
exactly. And you could sort of think about any time a new type of client or application or end user use case shows up at work, often the back end infrastructure has to figure out how to respond.
Yeah, it's a great point.
My last company in 2008 was a mobile security company called MobileIron, and I was the co-founder and CEO of that. We built that from sort of 3 people on a whiteboard in 2008 to when I stepped aside in 2016. We were $160 million a year in revenue, 12,000 enterprise customers, public on NASDAQ, and 1,000 employees.
Yeah, it's a pretty big company.
Yeah, no, really proud of that. Sort of built an industry, created a new category, and built a standalone business that's still thriving.
That's great. And so now you're sort of spending your time doing helping people understand the challenges around building enterprise software companies.
Yeah, so what I've been doing over the last year is a combination of seed investing and writing books on B2B entrepreneurship, and working on a new project now where me and another colleague are actually going to be buying small SaaS companies.
Oh, cool. So you wrote a book called Survival to Thrival,
right?
Which I've read most of, but I have seen you talk, watch a bunch of other things. So I'm really excited to kind of dive into some of these topics you bring up there. I think for anyone listening, there's just go get the book. It's amazing. It has a bunch of frameworks and ways to visualize the stuff we'll talk about. So let's dive in. Where should we start here?
Looking back through my experience at Aerospace and MobileIron, one of the things that I found kind of frustrating was that I think we spend so much time trying to build a product that customers want that often we don't think through what's the missing link between winning your first 10 customers and winning your next 1,000 customers. And it's that building of a go-to-market that as a first-time CEO, product-oriented CEO, frankly, I kind of struggled with and had to learn along the way. And I don't think I'm alone in that. I think a lot of entrepreneurs and first-time CEOs, particularly product-centric CEOs, figuring out how to build a repeatable go-to-market to unlock growth is not necessarily intuitive.
Yeah, it's quite hard. I think, from my perspective, you have an idea when you're starting, you know what you want to build the first time, you start to show it to people, and then you start to get feedback, right?
Right. And you're iterating on the product. And I think, we generally have a pretty good handle on what product market fit is.
Sure.
Right? How do you get to your first 10, 15, 20 paying reference customers that say good things about your product? And that iterative process, I think, feels somewhat natural to a product-centric CEO. And, for me at MobileIron in 2008, we spent the first 6 months talking to customers before we wrote a line of code or raised $1 venture capital. And, we weren't sure what the technology would be, but we wanted to make sure we really understood what the problem was the customers were going to go solve. And then we sort of backed into, okay, what's the technology solution? We need to be able to go solve that.
Well, so let's dig in there a little bit. Did you have a space in mind? Did you have an initial product thesis?
Yeah, so remember we talked about sort of the wave phenomena?
Yeah, right.
Like 2008, it was the very beginning of smartphones. iPhone had just been launched, but it was consumer-oriented. It was a BlackBerry Symbian Windows Phone world, right? Sort of laugh about that now. But you could start to see people bring them into work and be like, man, I want this. Like, you could just feel it. You could see it in people's eyes. And even though it was kind of messy and clunky and didn't always work very well, people were like, yeah, I want this. And as a side effect of one of my jobs at Cisco, I got to work with the Cisco IT team in 2007 when we rolled out 25,000 Palm Trios. And it was a mess. It was really hard on IT. Like, they were bleeding from the eyeballs.
How many again?
25,000 Palm Trios. It was probably the largest smartphone deployment in the world at the time.
That's amazing.
And IT was dying. But users were still like, gimme, 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 gimme. And I was like, okay, there's something there.
Yeah.
Right? Somebody should solve that problem. And when AJ and Suresh, who were my co-founders, sort of showed me what they were thinking about, like, hey, let's go see if we can figure out how to help smartphones get used at work. That was sort of as specific as we got in terms of the space. And then that's where spending time talking to customers for 6 months to really understand what the problems were, what their challenges would be, and roll the clock forward 12, 18 months and try and do a little future prediction, because it takes you a while to build a company. You want to sort of build for what the market's going to need in the future, not necessarily what they need right now.
Yeah, okay. And so how did you get in the door with these folks to even have those conversations? Are these folks you met
That's a great question. And one of the things I learned, and I think we learned with sort of that early customer research, is that a lot of potential customers are willing to be helpful. Like, if you just say, hey, look, we're thinking about building a company. We've got this idea about a general space. We'd love some feedback, love some advice. People love to give feedback and love to give advice. And I don't know, we probably had 70 or 80 customer meetings and getting feedback and advice. And, you know, some of it was just finding people through our network and calling them. Our seed investor was helpful introducing us to customers. Customers from our previous companies, we'd sort of ask them who the person was who was working on it. But if you just ask people like, hey, look, we're working on an idea. We'd love some advice. We'd love some input. You'd be surprised. A lot of people are willing to sort of help. And interestingly, those 80 sort of customer meetings eventually turned into something we called teaching customers. There's like about 40 of them where, you know, when you sort of meet with a potential customer and you get advice where you're like, hey, they seem to sort of understand the problem. And you're just sort of intuitively like, they seem to get it. You start to collect them. And they become sort of these customers that give you feedback, not just once, but multiple times. So they become what we call teaching customers. And then over time, if you sort of picture a funnel, those 40 teaching customers, you know, some of them fell off the list, but then like 15 of them became our alpha customers, and then 7 of them became our betas, and then 5 became our paying reference customers. So in many ways, in addition to really figuring out what we were going to go build, a lot of them ended up becoming sort of the pipeline for future alphas and betas.
Sure. And so the interesting part there, it's just even how you got to them, it feels like, you know, your relationships from aerospace were valuable, right?
Previous companies, sometimes just going to conferences and walking around talking to people, cold calling. Like,
okay,
it was a lot of shit. Oh, yeah.
You did some cold calling too in there.
Absolutely.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
But you had some credibility. So people would at least think like, okay, these guys they know a little bit about enterprise software and doing, you know, sort of IT
probably
stuff,
on the margin, but I mean, other than our previous customers, I'm not sure the other people knew who we were.
Okay.
So at some level, it was a karmic deposit to the universe that they were just willing to take a phone call and be willing to help.
Yeah, I love that. And so would you go meet them in person, do a phone call, remote?
It was a mix of them.
Okay.
I'd bet it was probably 50% phone call, 50% face-to-face. But over time, what happened was you start to feel the customers and prospects are willing to sort of keep giving you feedback and advice over time.
And so your initial thesis was around mobile and that you could help secure these devices.
It was just actually, it was more general than that. It's like, hey, these things are coming into the office and people are going to need to use them at work. How can we help? Like, what are the problems that the enterprise and IT is going to have as that happens? Part of it was a security problem. Part of it was a management problem. Part of it was, we started to hear about like new things, like this idea that people wanted to bring their personal smartphones to work. Remember, BYOD had not been really invented at this time.
Oh, right? So this is, okay.
This is pre-BYOD. Like, if you were really important, you got a BlackBerry at work, right? So, BlackBerry was a pager that just turned into a phone in 2008. So, like, you got to sort of rewind the time machine here.
So you were thinking, how do we not like
Palm Trio, BlackBerry, Symbian days,
but from IT out? Like, how do we distribute
everything? What were the problems that enterprises were going to have as these things start to show up at work?
But initially, your thought was like that the IT teams would distribute them.
Yeah, because that's the way it was always done before.
Right. Okay.
And then we started to hear about things. Well, people had this personal phone. Why can't I use this at work? It's like, well, because that's not allowed, or you got to keep your data separate, or we hadn't really thought about that before.
Okay, because ultimately that's what MobileIron really became, right? It was like
multi-OS and BYOD. It was really, how do you say yes to mobile and secure and manage it?
Right, because very few companies actually like they don't give you a company issued phone anymore, right?
No, but you rewind, from 2008 to 2012, probably 75% of the devices inside companies were company issued. I mean, we sort of look at that now and it's sort of laughable.
Right.
But that was the way it was. And, interestingly, that pattern of, hey, people are trying to bring phones to work, and, oh, wait, that means there's going to be a mixture of personal data and work data on there. Oh, that's going to be another problem that's going to need to be solved. So, like, as you start to spend time with customers and figuring out what these challenges are going to be, you can start to reverse into, what's the product you want to build, what problems do you want to solve. And, a great example of that is that we invented a concept called selective wipe, which is like, hey, if you have a BYOD device, you want to pull out your work content because you leave the company, but leave your pictures and music alone. Everybody kind of takes it for granted now that that's the way it worked.
Yeah.
That was not the case in 2010. And so we invented that concept, which is now just part of the way it's done.
That's cool. Yeah. So that
came from customer meetings and understanding what these challenges were and figuring out a problem to solve.
Okay. So then did it become really apparent that was the problem that you needed to solve? Or were there in the early days, as you're starting to do your customer research and figuring out your problems, then you're like, all right, we're going to go build a product, right? And you start iterating on, it's going to do this. Customer gives you feedback. Let's add that and see if they're interested. Oh, if they're interested. Oh, they're not interested. You start getting these this iteration and feedback about what people are interested and not interested in, and why they want to keep talking to you, why they don't want to keep talking to you. Right. So you're getting all these data points. And what's kind of confusing at the time is that you have this sort of bullseye that you think right? You're like, okay, I think I 75% know. What we ended up finding is that we needed to cast a slightly wider net from what we thought our bullseye was from talking to customers, and explore things a little bit to the left or a little bit to the right or a little bit up or a little bit down, because you're really looking for sort of hot spots where you start to see multiple customers with the same problem looking for the same solution. And the confusing part is we actually saw like 2 or 3 different clusters of where we were seeing customer interest from. And if you sort of imagine sort of a bullseye with sort of a slightly wider net around it, you get like these 3 hotspots. And that was fortunate that we had like 3 hotspots, right? Because sometimes you get 0. Sure.
Right? I'll tell you what it felt like, which is in some ways sort of exploring these adjacencies at the time kind of felt like heresy. It felt like we were kind of betraying our founding idea, that we're like, hey, this is what we're going to go build, and this is what we're going to go do based on customer feedback.
And you like rallied the team around this.
Yeah, and it's like, wait a minute, we're going to sort of test this thing over here. Wait a minute, that's not exactly what we said we were going to do. It feels like heresy. And this one, I'll give you the very specific example, was at this time, the mobile world was all BlackBerry, Symbian, and Windows Phone.
Isn't it still?
Somewhere in the world. Maybe in Ottawa, Canada. Yeah. And the iPhone had just come out. At that point, it was just a consumer device. Nobody was using it at work. But we started to see some customers who were like, man, we'd love to try and figure out how to use iPhone at work. But if you looked at market data was like, it's all Symbian, BlackBerry, Windows Phone. iPhone's really not an enterprise, so don't pay any attention to that. So if we'd actually been analytical about it, we would have ignored it. But we just started hearing customer feedback that they were like struggling with it. They're like, dude, can you help me with iPhone?
Is this like right after the iPhone launch, like instantly,
with
or
like
is it
12
like
months?
Okay,
Yeah,
so maybe
like,
the iPhone 3G comes out and it's like starts to really.
Oh, it was way before that.
Oh, even before that.
Yeah,
Okay,
it was
great.
before
Wow.
that, yeah. So we started doing some experiments. Like we actually built our first prototype for our iPhone management security product on like a couple Post-it notes. I still have it somewhere actually. And it was sort of a controversy at the time about should we spend engineering resources to go prototype this thing and go test this adjacency, right?
And how big was the company? How many people at this point?
20.
Okay. So 20 people, a pretty good size people. You're moving around and saying, hey, we got this really interesting thing over here. We might want to go test.
Yeah. And, because we were seeing traction in some of the other parts of the market, we're like, oh, let's go test this adjacency.
Yeah.
It feels like a distraction, right? You can sort of translate adjacency into distraction.
Yeah, you got to focus, right? You got to focus.
focus. Yeah. But the reality is if you focus, and pick the wrong thing, you're dead.
Great point.
Right. And more often than not, that the hot spot that actually helps you unlock growth is a little bit to the left, a little bit to the right, or a little bit up and a little bit down. So you have to sort of cast a slightly wider net. And it's hard at the time because you got limited resources, limited time, you want to focus, and it frankly feels kind of like heresy because you kind of feel like you're betraying your founding idea a little bit. But I think if you talk to most founders that have built successful companies and like really pull apart the origin story, the success was unlocked by something that wasn't quite exactly what they thought it was going to be in the beginning. And that's normal, and that's good. But you have to give yourself just enough rope to find it.
And so for you, that was just, hey, we have all these iPhones. Help me with this iPhone problem. And so you started building like features around that?
So how do you solve the problem for managing and securing and deploying iPhones in the enterprise?
Okay.
Right. And actually, Apple hadn't figured it out at the time.
And was this also from like a central IT out, not
central
from
IT out,
BYOD still at that point?
It wasn't even BYOD at that point.
It was like, okay, we're a cool company. We want to give our employees iPhones instead of BlackBerries. How do we do that? Because like the CEO wants an iPhone. They don't want to have a BlackBerry anymore.
That's a great example of how finding urgency. One of our early deals was with a large biotech company. And they had no business buying a mobile management security product from a little company of 30 people. Right? Like, why would they buy from us? Right. But the problem, they were like, their exec team was beating the snot out of the IT team, basically said, look, figure out how to let us use iPhones or you're fired. And the IT team was like, okay, we'll go figure that out.
That's urgency.
Right.
Yeah.
And so, that urgency is what gave permission to these buyers to make a bet on a small little company with very few customers that might die someday. Right? You have to kind of put yourself in the position of your customers. In the early days, our very first customer was a company called Windsor Foods. If you turn over a Costco burrito, it's made by Windsor Foods.
Oh, okay.
And Stefan was the director of IT at Windsor Foods. And our first deal was $6,000. Tiny, right? But imagine the conversation Stefan had with his boss. Hey, I got to go buy this management security product from this company called MobileIron for mobility. And my boss says, great, tell me about them. Well, they're 25 people. Great. Who other customers have you had? We're the first. Are they going to even be around? I don't know. Right? I mean, put yourself in the shoes of Stefan, right? He had to really stick out his neck.
Yeah.
To
being first is
us.
tough. Yeah.
Yeah. And even the first 5, 6, 7, 8, they're all making the same bet.
But you did give him risk-adjusted pricing, right?
Yeah. At that point, it was really just about just pay us something.
That's a good deal, right?
Yeah, it was a great deal.
Yeah.
And you just want customers using it and being able to say good things.
Sure.
Product market fit is how do you get those first 10, 15, 20 customers that are willing to use your product, say good things, and pay you some money.
Yep.
Right. That's really the test. And but one of the hard things at that point in time, and I think a lot of early stage companies go through this. You remember the multiple hotspots I'd sort of talked about? We felt these couple clusters that eventually you have to pick one. So we probably had 15, 20 customers, and they were sort of spread across sort of the iPhone hotspot cluster. We had some people doing Symbian and BlackBerry, and we actually had this other application to help people sort of manage costs on mobile devices because that was a big issue at the time.
Okay. Manage the minutes or data or something?
Well, it was international roaming and surprise roaming, plan overages. It was a huge deal in 2008, 2009, right? And so, listening to customers, you're trying to solve their problems, and we heard a lot of customers articulating that problem. And we won some customers for that. part of the product. Well, if you imagine us sort of having these 3 clusters of customers that had 3 different types of characteristics, we eventually had to pick one to go focus on. And as a result, we had to prune and stop doing that product that those other customers had bought. And that was brutal, right? Here's this company, PPDI, a big company in North Carolina, that basically bought this product from us. They made a bet. They did the Stefan thing where they went to their boss and said, hey, I'm going to buy this product from this company you've never heard of that's going to help us.
And you like shook their hand.
Took their money,
right?
Gave them the product, and then we had to call them back like 3 or 4 months later and be like, hey, we're end-of-lifing that product.
Oh, man.
Oh, it's brutal.
Yeah.
But you have to prune these things. Once you find your hotspot, focus on that, build your go-to-market on that, build your repeatability on that. These other things, like, it'll hold you back. It'll get in the way, but you're kind of screwing some customers as a result. Man, that's painful. And you want to be customer-centric, and these people bet on you, and you're stranding them. And so I flew to North Carolina, wanted to go meet the customer. I'm like, all right, look, really sorry to tell you, we're going to be end-of-lifing this.
Oh, you flew there
I flew there. And I actually walked in with a check and gave them their money back.
Wow.
Which was a lot of money at the time for us. Like, we debooked it. And I told them why. Just said, look, this is a valid problem, but we're going to be focused on another problem. And frankly, we could sort of maybe ham and egg it and try and keep the product alive that you bought from us, but we're just not going to do a very good job of it. And you're going to end up regretting it, we're going to end up regretting it, so we might as well just like not do it. And gave them their money back. Now, the interesting sort of epilogue to that story is like 2 years later, they became a customer on our mainline product.
Okay, nice.
So eventually the hotspot that other customers we had seen, PPDI had as well. So that was sort of a nice epilogue to that story.
Yeah, and you didn't burn the bridge so much that they weren't willing to work with you in the future. So I'm guessing flying there, handing them a check, like those are all like, that's a lot. That's, can I say, the hardest part is the human part, right? Like they trusted you to do this thing. And so you're going back. Yeah.
And internally, like your sales team's like, wait a minute, we're not going to sell this anymore. We got customers we could sell this to.
Yeah.
Right. And you're an early stage CEO going, man, I'm just trying to win some customers to get some revenue. And
gotta get that ARR up.
I'm like saying no to that.
Yeah.
Like it's super counterintuitive, really painful at the time. But, getting to sort of how do you really unlock growth? You got to find that hotspot that has urgency. I often get asked, like, how do you create urgency? And in my head, the little voice says, if you're asking that question, you're already half in trouble.
Sure.
Because it's much better to find urgency that's already there. If you're in a situation where you have to create urgency, it's doable. You can do it. It's not a fool's errand. But man, it's way better if you can actually just find urgency and capitalize on it.
Yeah, it's hard to create urgency. I've had 2 companies, Replicated included, where urgency is always a problem, right? And like, how do we get these folks to really get how much this is going to help them now? And so you end up trying to do things and calculate ROI and show them, better, like try to create metrics around it. But ultimately, if they don't have the urgency to do it right now, it's hard to get them to
Why buy now versus 6 months from now?
Right.
Doing nothing is often your biggest competitor.
Yeah.
And being able to find urgency is
like you're going to get fired if you can't get me an iPhone, right? Like
right, and we found urgency.
That's huge.
And that was a big deal. And often you see these big waves that are sort of creating transitions in markets. For us, it was sort of the transition to mobility. What do I do about iPhone? What do I do about BYOD? What do I do about apps? Like there were sort of these waves of change that created urgency inside customers. And I think that happens all around sort of enterprise software. There's waves of change that sort of force or create problems where people go, oh crap, I got to do something.
Yeah.
And if you can find one of those hotspots that has urgency, that's one of the key ingredients to really being able to unlock growth. Because you can have a great product, you can have a great go-to-market playbook, but if there's no urgency, you're just not going to unlock growth. It's going to be a slog.
So you have these frameworks for company building and sort of enterprise software creation.
The benefit of hindsight.
Right, yeah. Yeah, you approached everything you did at MobileIron with you knew all this ahead of time.
Oh, yeah. No. Oh, man. The amount of like battle scars on my back is numerous.
Yeah, these are hard-won frameworks that you
yeah,
have
stuff
created.
I wish I had kind of known.
Right.
Like this is if I could write myself a letter sitting on my desk 10 years ago, what would I tell myself? This would be one of them.
But that urgency, first you have like idea creation, you have product market fit. Where do you put urgency in that?
Let me give you the context on this. So like the real struggles in enterprise software and building B2B SaaS companies is a lot of times you can get to product market fit. Like you can really ham and egg your way to your first 10, 15, 20 customers. And then you're like, okay, great, I've got product market fit, time to grow. Woo, let's go hire a bunch of salespeople, invest in marketing. And you wake up 6 months later and you went from 20 customers to like 22 or 24 or 25. And your burn rate went up and everybody's looking around going, uh-oh, scary. And there's a ton of companies that get to product market fit but never unlock growth. The reason is that there's, I think, in my mind, sort of a missing link between those two. That, when you look at all the B2B software companies that really unlock growth, they found something in between product market fit and growth. And the funny thing is it didn't really have a name, which is in and of itself kind of interesting, right?
Yeah.
So we coined the term go-to-market fit.
Which I think is perfect. Yeah.
Which, happens sort of on the tail end of product market fit, which is how do you find and win customers over and over and over and over and over again with some level of urgency? Right. And it's like, it sounds simple, but it's hard to do. So this concept of go-to-market fit I found really helpful. And if you look through the rearview mirror at MobileIron, we nailed go-to-market fit. And sort of what was that? It was number one, you found urgency, which answers the question like, why now and not 6 months from now? And for us, it was the dude helped me with iPhone.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. And it was help me not get fired.
Right. My CEO wants an iPhone.
Yeah. Like it's funny. I think, if I was listening to this now, I would be kind of laughing. Well, of course, that's obvious now. But like in 2009, that was not that obvious.
Sure.
The second thing is, what's your go-to-market model? Like, how do you sell? Do you hire salespeople and go up the middle? Do you do online evals and then have inside sales, or are you sort of a zero-touch sales model like a Twilio or SendGrid? Like, what is your sales model? I think you got to sort of pick one. And then the third one is having a repeatable go-to-market playbook, which is how do you just find and win customers over and over again from the first time you touch them to when you win them and make them successful. And when you have those three things, you've got urgency, you've got your go-to-market model picked, and you've got a playbook you can do over and over and over again. That's when companies unlock growth. And I think, just being able to have sort of a framework around it that give people a way to sort of think about crossing, solving this missing link between product market fit and growth, like, is helpful. I don't know, maybe it'd be useful to sort of touch on this, sort of how do you even figure out what your go-to-market looks like?
Yeah, let's dive into it. You have these great frameworks for each of these, right? Because most people think about, like, how do I want to sell this thing? And they don't really know how to think about it. And I think you have a really great way.
Yeah, when I was going through this in 2009, I found this whole discussion super confusing, right? It was like, well, big ticket, small ticket, complicated product, simple product, sell through the channel, not through the seller channel.
Right. Is it over? Right, what's your ACV? Confusing. Is it over 50K? Is it, what?
Yeah, I was like, like, it was super confusing.
Yeah.
And the way I think about it now is sort of the benefit of hindsight. If you sort of think about a slider, on the left-hand side, you have sort of heavy touch sales, which is sort of classic up the middle enterprise selling where you got sales teams talking to customers. In the middle of the slider, you got what I call like marketing-led sales model, which is like, you do digital demand generation, you drive customers to your website, you may get them to an online eval, you gather some metrics, and then like inside sales picks up the phone, starts calling them, then closes. But there's a human sort of picks up the ball about halfway through.
Sure.
And then on the far right, you've got sort of product-led zero-touch sales, like what a Twilio or SendGrid does, where there's no salespeople. It's almost self-service. And, how do you sort of figure out where on that spectrum you should be?
Yeah, I think this is the question. It's like everyone kind of understands that those are like different models.
Right.
But like how
do you know?
Yeah, how do you know which one you are?
Well, the first thing is I've seen a lot of companies get bum steers from their investors on this because they'll be like, go do frictionless zero-touch sales because that's sort of in vogue or in style right now. And venture capitalists love it because you don't have to spend money on sales, right? So it is very efficient, like great. The trick is there is no one right sales and go-to-market model. There's only what's the right one for you and your product and your customers. And you have to pick whatever the right one is for you. It's okay to experiment with different ones and have a thesis about what it is, But in order for you to unlock growth, you really have to pick one, because I don't think small companies can sort of run multiple go-to-markets at the same time and really unlock growth. You really get to pick one. So how do you sort of figure out where on the spectrum you live? And there's a couple things that helped me. One was, there's a great article Mark Leslie, who's the CEO at Veritas, now a professor at Stanford, wrote called Leslie's Compass. It's up on LinkedIn. You can look at it. Sort of a good article about sort of how to think about this. I actually found, interestingly, what simplified it for me is it all comes down to one question.
And what's that question?
How does the customer decide to buy? It's not how do they physically buy, not the logistics of buying, not the characteristics of buying. It's actually what is the cognitive process going on inside that customer for them to go from I'm not buying to I'm buying. And let me explain this for a sec, because think about the times where you've been a customer buying a product from a vendor, right? Like you went through a cognitive process from the first time you figured out your need to what you're going to pick. Like every purchasing decision goes through that same thing. So as you're winning your early deals and losing early deals, like you tend to pay attention to why you lost, why you won. At the same time, pay attention to how your customer actually made the decision to buy. Because if you think about that spectrum I talked about earlier, if the buyer and decider are the same person, you can reach them over digital marketing and your product's relatively well understood, you can do zero-touch sales. You should be able to try that. But if the buyer and decider are two different people, like the VP of marketing and the CEO, like, for example, like look at Marketo or something like that, right? How did MobileIron decide to buy Marketo when we bought Marketo? Well, my VP of marketing said, hey, I want to buy this, came to me, the CEO, and said, will you approve it? We talked about it for a little while, and I said yes, right? So the buyer and decider were two different people, but they're kind of like right next to each other. That one sort of is in the middle of the spectrum. You got two people, buyer and decider, kind of right next to each other. You can do marketing-led sales. If the buying decision is more of a committee, where the cognitive process of making a decision to buy involves like 5 or 6 different people, like you're probably going to need like heavy touch sales, because part of sales job is actually coordinating that decision inside the company, right? So that's sort of what really simplified this problem for me, is like, how does your customer decide to buy? Like, what's the cognitive process? One person, buyer and decider, 2 people sitting right next to each other, or is it a group of people? And, for us at MobileIron, like when we were selling large enterprise, it was the committee decision, right? There's like 5 or 6 different people involved. So we couldn't do zero-touch sales if our life depended on it.
Yes. So that was going to be my next question is, do you think that there are any levers that a company can pull to move in one direction more than the other? Obviously, like probably price, if you make it really expensive.
Well, it's interesting. Like people sort of say, oh, if it's a big ticket,
right?
Like, of course. Well, the reason why high prices tend to lead to committee sales is the way companies buy. If it's a big purchase process, more people are involved, right? If it's smaller, less people are involved.
Right.
So price is more of a symptom of the decision. Like if you have a product that is low priced but has a committee decision, that's probably going to be a really tough sales model.
Right. So it's interesting to think about this.
You can have
right?
high-priced products that are relatively easy decisions. Like if you find those, like that's great.
Sure. But I mean, do you think that, are there other levers around, okay, is it cross-functional? Like, what starts to make the buyer and decider a different person? Is it company size? Like, what are some of the other levers if you want to try to move it in terms of, we want to start to go more enterprise. We want to start to go more, self-serve.
A lot of it has to do with the type of product and the problem you're solving.
Okay.
Right? Like, if you look at the low-friction sales models, they tend to be like you're selling to like an engineer in DevOps, or you're selling to like the marketing manager, and they can just sort of decide and do it. So if you're solving a relatively narrow problem that has sort of a small audience, that tends to lean there if it's a relatively well-understood product. If your product is like a new product that people don't really understand, or it's a new concept that you have to explain.
Sure.
Like that's just the case. Like in some products, like it's a new thing. That's part of why you're innovating and building a new
category
company.
Creation, right?
Yeah, like if you're doing category creation, like I don't know, I'm sure maybe somebody could find an example of a low friction sales model for a new category, but
yeah,
kind of skeptical.
Sure.
So, the simpler the product, the simpler the buying decision, the lower the price, the narrower the audience, the more you sort of go to the zero-touch side. But you know what? If you're solving a hard problem that involves a bunch of different people and you're being part of transforming something inside a company, sometimes it's just going to be a heavier weight sales process, and that's okay.
Sure. And I think the interesting piece here is like, the framework is not, okay, what leverage are you going to pull? It's like, okay, this will give you the insight. Look at the decision process.
You can
for
change
buying.
your product and change the problem you're solving because you want to steer it a certain direction.
Right.
Now, you have to validate that that's actually going to work.
Sure.
But yeah, you can steer it.
But generally, it's like people need to kind of know they have a product.
You have to be intellectually honest about what's actually happening in the market when people buy your product.
Right. And if you kind of go through this exercise and think about like what is the
cognitive process for how they decide,
then you'll get an answer, right?
Right.
And that answer, you can lean into it if you want to keep your exact same product.
You can test
right?
different things, right? You could say, hey, let's test the high velocity model. Let's test the online eval followed by inside sales. Let's test the up the middle. Let's see what works. I mean, you iterate and go to market the same way you iterate on product.
That's interesting.
Yeah, that was an interesting aha for me, is you sort of iterate on go to market the same way you iterate on product.
How do you do that? How do you track that? How do you think about that?
How do you think about that?
Yeah.
Yeah, so this gets to how do you build your go to market playbook?
Mm-hmm.
This is a really important concept that, frankly, as a first-time product-oriented CEO in 2009, I was completely ridiculously wrong about. So rewind to actually this is probably, it's like late 2009. We had our first product in the market, winning our first customers. We're trying to sort of unlock growth and find repeatability. And I had hired sort of 2 sales folks and then hired a VP of sales. And my new VP of sales was like, all right, we need to build our go-to-market playbook. And in my head, I translated go-to-market playbook to that means a good PowerPoint pitch.
Go-to-market
good
pitch
sales
deck.
decks. Yeah, I need a good pitch deck.
Yeah.
And I was like, now in the rearview mirror, I realized how ridiculously wrong and naive and narrow-minded that view was. And so if you think about the go-to-market playbook, it's how do you repeatably find and win customers over and over again? Like when you first find them, what do you do? What's that journey the customer goes on, and you have to walk them through from the very first time you find them and connect with them all the way to the way you make the decision. It's not, hey, I've got a good PowerPoint presentation.
Right.
Right. PowerPoint presentation might show up somewhere in there, but it's like a bullet, like on a list somewhere. So how did we sort of figure that out? And ours kind of started by accident on a guy named Mike Lee's whiteboard.
Okay.
So in the very beginning of finding go-to-market repeatability and finding go-to-market fit, one of the problems is founders can't find go-to-market fit. Founders cannot find go-to-market repeatability because inherently the founder selling process is not repeatable. Founders have magic pixie dust. You can get meetings that nobody else can get. You can say things in meetings nobody else can say. You can be like, here's the 27 things we could do. You can commit to stuff in meetings. It's totally not repeatable.
Yeah.
Right? And so ironically, finding repeatable sales motion, if the founder's trying to do it, you're getting all sorts of false signals. So what's the answer to that? So I actually recommend that you need to hire sort of more like a Davy Crockett kind of couple early sales reps or marketing people to kind of find the path through the woods and iterate and try stuff and try this problem, try this message, sort of iterate on it. And one of our Davy Crockett.
What are the skill sets of a Davy Crockett? How do you find what?
Yeah, so Mark Leslie also, interestingly, has a thing he wrote called the Renaissance Sales Rep, sort of similar thing. I call them Davy Crockett because I think the metaphor of finding the path through the woods is kind of descriptive. So they tend to be like 60% sales, like picking up the phone, go talk to people, pitch, and like 20% product marketing and 20% product management. Okay. Like they tend to have a little bit of marketing bones in them, and they also have a little bit of product bones in them because they go meet with customers and they try things. Try this, try that. What about this problem? What about that problem? Hey, if we can't help you with that, what about that? Like they're iterating, they're testing things, and they're kind of making stuff up, and that's okay. And
but this kind of sounds like a founder.
Yes, but it's a normal salesperson.
Right. Exactly. Right. That's actually the interesting thing. It's like these people are potentially good founders at some point. They kind of have that, a little bit of that discover the problem.
They've got the explorer gene in them.
But they're not the founders. Really important in this case.
Yeah,
right?
Typically a product-led founder built the product with the vision.
Right.
So one of our early Davy Crockett's was a guy named Mike Lee. Mike had a whiteboard in his office that, picture this. He's just trying to get customers to keep talking to us. Right. So he had this list on the whiteboard that on one side was like the stuff that seemed to work to get people to keep talking to us, and stuff on the other side that was like, I thought this was going to work, but it wasn't going to work. And he just did it for himself, right? Because that's what he's trying to do. He's just trying to figure things out. What was interesting is then the rest of us started to pay attention to Mike's whiteboard. Wait a minute, that worked? That's interesting. What do you mean that didn't work? We worked really hard on that. We're offended that that didn't work, right? So that became sort of the real world test chamber for what we thought was going to get customers to keep talking to us, which in some ways is the very early part of building your go-to-market playbook. From how do you get a customer to talk to you once, talk to you twice, talk to you 3 times, engage, do an eval, spend time with you, like just those.
Okay, so the things that showed up on his, people will talk about this.
They're willing to spend more time talking to you, right? Because if customers are willing to spend more time with you, it's at least a signal that you're onto something.
Yeah.
It's important.
So like iPhones was on the, they will talk more about iPhones.
Yeah, they're like, oh, yeah, tell me more about that.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
And
but like, some Windows Phone, they were like deaf to, right?
Yeah, it was less interesting, right?
Sure.
They're like,
And so
there's other things that we thought were going to be important that weren't too, right?
And you're trying to basically sound like you're kind of building this catalog of different things that you can then
needs and problems and stories and who they're talking to, and it's like iterating on who the ideal customer is. How do you get their attention? What do you do in a first meeting? What happens in a second meeting? How do you get them to an eval? And an eval, what are they doing? Like, you're basically sort of starting to build like this customer journey. And so what does a go-to-market playbook look like? So you sort of have a vision across the top. You have like the steps in the customer journey. Like, and like if it's a heavyweight sales model, it might be like, hey, you have a, marketing does lead gen qualification, hand it off to inside sales. You have a first meeting, you have a second meeting, you have an evaluation, you have a decision meeting, you have a win, they have onboarding, right? Whatever, like 5, 6 steps, right?
Sure.
And under each one of those, you sort of have what are people doing and saying in each stage. Or if it's a marketing-led sales model, you got like, okay, messages with SEO, SEM, how are you getting people on the landing page? What's some online video content that you're doing for education to get people more engaged? How are you nurturing them? Oh, you get them to an eval. Great. Eval, you get eval onboarding. Like you could start to figure out like this, building this musculature for what's step 1, what's step 2, what's step 3, what's step 4, what's step 5 on the customer journey, and what are people doing and saying at each stage, like is what becomes your go-to-market playbook. And I had one company I was working with that they showed me their go-to-market playbook, and it was like 50 pages.
Oh.
And I'm like, that's not a go-to-market playbook. That's a brain dump.
Yeah.
Right, of everything you've ever learned. But a go-to-market playbook, like ours fit on 1 page. It was like 1 PowerPoint slide. Maybe 2. But like it's the distillation of it down to sort of the essence of what's the customer journey, what are people doing and saying at each stage, and like what's the rest of the company doing to be able to support each one of those stages. And how you sort of figure this out is as you're in your early customer engagements, like pay attention to not just your wins. Pay attention to the losses. Why'd you lose? Why did a deal go fast? Why did it go slow? Why did a deal disappear? Why did it get big? Why did it get small? Like those is like the universe sort of giving you feedback about what's working and what's not working to help sort of build this go-to-market playbook. And you'll discover things in there that become part of your go-to-market motion. And there's something I call the wows, which is, when you're in a customer meeting, and I'm sure like, you've been through this, and anybody who's tried to sell new products, you go sit down with a meeting and a customer, and you go, here, blah, 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 you're going through your pitch. And there's something you talk about where all of a sudden the prospect's body language changes, and they kind of stand up or they lean in, they're like, wait, tell me more.
Perfect.
Right?
Yeah.
That's a clue that you're onto like a wow, which is something that got their attention that makes them want to spend more time with you. Like, those are really important to find those in your early part of your go-to-market playbook. Like, what are the things that cause customers to go, wow, I want to spend more time with you? And sometimes there's 1, sometimes you can find 2, sometimes you can find 3. But the trick is, and it's funny, as a product-centric founding CEO, like, you always sort of think you know what the wows are.
Sure.
Or your product team thinks they know what the wows are. Your engineering team thinks they know what the wows are. The funny thing is you don't get to decide. I didn't get to decide. Your customers decide.
Yeah.
And the weird thing is sometimes the wows are not what you thought they were. You, of course, intuitively imagine it to be the thing you work the hardest on and that you're most proud of.
It's the most complex engineering problem in the background.
Yeah, super exciting.
There's
super
a DAG back there that's deciding what's happening.
And we have this really awesome big giant policy engine that helps you do blah, 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 blah. And often it's something that could be even smaller than you thought, but customers go, wait a minute, tell me more about that.
Yeah.
So keep your eyes open for those, and the customer gets to decide the wow, not you. And be prepared to be a little offended because sometimes it might be something small, but that's okay. I'll give you an example. So for us, one of the wows in the early days was when we were pioneering bring your own device, we sort of invented this concept called selective wipe. Right? So we would walk in and be like, hey, we have this product that helps provide security and management for any mobile operating system to help you embrace mobile as a first-class citizen. We were really excited about our big giant security and policy engine. And the customer would be like, we'd show them this ability to wipe your work stuff but leave your pictures and music alone. They'd be like, wow, show me more, right? And it was a cool feature.
Yeah.
But it wasn't that hard to build.
Yeah.
And it sort of felt like, we're like, really? Is that what it is? And ironically, we actually buried the feature down in our UI because it was like logically located where it was supposed to be, but like we kind of buried the golden
like
egg,
employee offboarding,
Yeah,
it's
exactly.
Like,
it was sort of down there.
Deprovision that user.
Yeah, exactly. It was like, oh, wait, that's actually like a wow feature.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah, the funny thing is at the time, most customers didn't even have BYOD, right? So like if we had measured that feature on usage, we would have gotten a totally false signal. That was a super important feature to get customers to keep talking to us, engage with us, keep moving. That was definitely a wow. But if we measured it on usage, then we've gotten a totally false signal. And I'll give you like a second wow. And again, this was something that came from meetings with customers.
So that last one, do you think it's because that's where the market was eventually, I mean, we have hindsight now, so eventually everyone was going to BYOD and that would become a thing that would enable BYOD because now you could selectively wipe. And so
I think there was an element of being ahead of the curve.
Yeah.
Right. So sometimes you're ahead of the curve. Like that's a capability that gets people to want to spend time with you, engage with you, and it's part of the reason they buy your product, but maybe they're just not going to use it yet.
Sure.
Interestingly, the second wow for us had very similar characteristics, which was we invented a concept called the Enterprise App Store. Everyone's used to the App Store in sort of the consumer world. We built the first enterprise app store for companies to be able to deliver apps to their employees' phones.
Like internally developed apps?
Yeah, internally developed apps for App Store.
Very cool.
And it was a killer demo. Customers were like, wow. The funny thing is, no customers had any apps. Right? Yeah. But again, like if we had measured that based on usage.
But everybody wanted an app. They wanted an app. So it was like,
aspirational.
We want to have an app that's cool. And everybody has an app idea.
We're going to have one someday, right?
Every IT guy's got some app idea. They're going to app this and there's an app for that. So yeah.
Right. I mean, there are definitely capabilities, as part of the go-to-market playbook that would show and the competitive evaluations, things like that were much more usage-based. But the thing I think on this is there are certain things where the customer's body language change, where they're going to want to spend more time with you. They get to decide what those are, build those into your go-to-market playbook, draw a big circle around them. Sometimes you have to do like redesign on your product to sort of elevate the wows. And it's okay if it doesn't get used.
Yeah, so this is interesting because the wows, like, should you use that as signal for like, okay, let's build more features around selective wipe and make this a really big part of our product set? Or should you be like, okay, it gets everyone to go, wow, but like the real value is in all the other stuff we do?
I think the answer is sort of it depends.
Okay.
In some cases, the wows may just stay sort of isolated little wows that just are exciting things that get people to keep talking to you. Sometimes it's a precursor of things to come that becomes sort of a end-to-end set of capabilities that customers use over time, and it's just early. I've seen both.
Okay, so as you're getting that feedback, right? Someone's like, wow, that's really amazing, but they're not using it today. Like, you sort of just like keep it on the radar as a thing. And you're like, look, people still really like this. Let's make sure we don't ignore it. Let's put it up higher in the product so it's more exposed. And then as people start using it more, we start to dig into, actually building features around it.
Yeah, I think you could see that, like, as it starts to get really adopted, then you start really building the workflows around it and expanding it. I think, particularly if you look at a go-to-market playbook where you're driving customers through nurturing to online demos and self-driven evals. Like being able to have the customer to be able to discover the things that they go, wow, and they want to spend more time in your demo, the things that keep going, like, especially in a self-driven demo and eval kind of world, you have to be super deliberate about what these wows are. And then that gets to the next part of the go-to-market playbook, which is, okay, once you get the customer sort of engaged, how do you get them across the line? And, in many cases that involves an evaluation, a POC, things like that. And being really deliberate about what that part of the experience looks like and what are the supporting tools and things you need to be able to deliver to your go-to-market team to be able to do that. I'll give you an example. So for us, when customers would go into an eval mode, like we would drive customers to eval, like, hey, Mr. Customer, because that's a sign like it's a real deal. They're willing to spend time with you. Maybe they're bringing in competitors. Like it's go time, right? And you have to be able to build a repeatable process for evaluations. Now, what's funny is in the early days of markets, customers often don't know how to evaluate products.
Sure.
Right? They just give themselves a left to right UI tour through your product and just sort of like a random walk in the woods. So the one thing we realized, like, oh, wait, we get to actually kind of tell the customer what to do to how to evaluate the product, which is an awesome place to be. So we ended up creating this Excel spreadsheet that basically was like, here's the 10 things you go test in an evaluation, Mr. Customer. And if they turn all are green, of course you buy, right? So you get to set the table. And you'd be surprised in a lot of cases, particularly in newer category creations, customers don't know how to evaluate the products. You get to set the table for how evaluations happen. The second thing is that sometimes you can stick stuff in there that becomes competitive traps, which is, if you think about like your go-to-market playbook, there's often like an evaluation guide or a self-driven demo or a self-driven eval. Like get really prescriptive about that. And you're going to put stuff in there that, of course, if you get to these 10 things and they all turn green, you should buy. But you can also stick sort of second order things in there. This is one of the things I learned was you can stick sort of second order capabilities or tests in there that aren't actually that important in the grand scheme of things, but your competitors are going to be pissed about. Because the customer's going to ask your competitor about X or Y, and they're going to be like, oh, right? And they're going to try and do the same thing to you, right? So this is where sort of the hand-to-hand combat happens in the go-to-market playbook is sort of in this eval POC stage. Like, how do you define the decision criteria? How do you set the table for the customer? And how do you lay traps?
Yeah. And so, like that's a really important part of the go-to-market, right? Is understanding if you're early in a market, you can set the sort of
decision criteria.
Yeah, the expectations, right? And then you can deliver that to your customers. And then just producing it as an asset, right? Like, hey, we distribute this along, take a look.
And it became part of your core training for your sales team, your go-to-market teams, or for your marketing team to build the online evals. Like, you have to get really prescriptive about it. And it becomes very cross-functional, right? It's your product team, your marketing team, your sales engineers. Like, this is where sort of the collective IQ of the company in many ways about what's winning and losing deals. Like, this is like the sharp edge of the sword on the ground inside customers, deal by deal by deal by deal. So yes, you have to get really deliberate about it. And there's a feedback loop there. Like as the market evolves, you're like, oh, there's something new we're seeing in the market. We got to change this part of the go-to-market playbook. And then you got to get everybody on board with changing it. So it's the go-to-market playbook becomes like the core operating system for your whole go-to-market motion. It becomes like muscles. And that was the thing that was amazing is when you get the go-to-market playbook right and you get the urgency and the sales model defined, like the way is you just start to feel the momentum. You put more in, you get more out. You start to feel the momentum and you can hire new salespeople. They know what to do to win deals. You add channels, you give them the playbook. Here's how you win deals. You add somebody new in marketing, here's what we do. Which is like as you start to get that machinery going and that playbook going, like it's magic because you start to feel the momentum and it becomes like muscle memory and just chugga, 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 chugga. Now, there's an interesting sort of side story to this is that over time, you need to evolve and change your go-to-market playbook.
Right, I was thinking about that because markets change, other things happen, right?
Or you add like a major new product capability.
Sure.
So ironically, the power of getting go-to-market fit and your go-to-market playbook right is the repeatability of it. The challenge of it is when you need to change it, you have to rewire muscle memory that's like gotten built into your team where it's almost subconscious. So like making changes to your go-to-market playbook and the way your team goes to market is not that easy.
Right.
We got an interesting story there where, like 2012 MobileIron, we'd probably 1,000 customers at this point. So we really had a go-to-market playbook cooking.
Yeah, sure.
And we went from selling one product to selling a platform with 3 different products and an ecosystem. And that was a fundamental change to our go-to-market playbook, and I totally underestimated that. So we basically created a new pitch, rolled out some training, went through it.
Training internal, like
training
for
internal,
teams,
like
sales
yeah,
teams,
and like
pitch.
new website, new pitch, new demos, stuff like that.
So you had all the collateral.
All the collateral. We did a bunch of training.
Yeah.
And then 60 days later, everybody just kind of went back to doing what they were doing before. And it was frustrating. And I think changing your go-to-market playbook, it's sort of like, unlearning like major muscle memory and relearning muscle memory. It kind of takes a little bit of shock and energy to be able to do it.
Sure.
So I was frustrated, and the team and I were sort of struggling with what to do. We're like, all right, should we just repeat what we did before and just do it again? We decided to sort of do more of a shock therapy. So we basically made every single sales rep and every single sales engineer present the new pitch to me as CEO one-on-one and get graded.
As if you were a customer.
As if I was a customer.
Yeah.
And it absorbed like 2 weeks of my time.
Yeah.
Which you could argue maybe wasn't that efficient. But what happened was it sent a signal like, hey, this is really important. Please spend time on this. And we got a chance to see who was really good and who wasn't as good at sort of making the change. And that level of sort of intensity around rewiring your go-to-market playbook is almost what's required. And I think you see a lot of companies stumble at this when they go from selling a single product to multi-products, or they've got a major shift in what they're doing. They just kind of stuff it through the go-to-market playbook that they built that was working.
Right.
And they're like, it doesn't work. And it's hard. So, it took us like real shock therapy kind of for ourselves to rewire our go-to-market playbook. Now, fast forward like 90 days after that, we started cranking, and fast forward a year, like 60% of our sales came off the new products and new platform capabilities that came out of changing that go-to-market playbook.
And I'm guessing like that process where you made everybody pitch you, like there was probably a bunch of feedback that happened, and I'm guessing some iteration on, because they're like, well, here's why I don't do it that way, and here, and so, is that right?
Oh yeah. Well, I mean, in many ways, like when we did the rollout number 1, we had a lot of feedback that came in sort of as part of rollout number 1, and then there was a sort of painful relapse period. And then we did sort of the more intense sort of shock therapy to rewire, how we went to market. And there's a lot of feedback. I mean, I learned a lot from listening to everybody sort of tell the story, be like, oh, that didn't work very well, or, oh, that was really good. And actually, there's a great example where there was like one woman who was a channel sales rep in Europe who absolutely just crushed the new story and was like better than all of us. It was like, keep an eye on her. She should get promoted. And we're like, yeah, we're going to adopt some of the things she said.
Yeah.
Right. So, as part of that rewiring, you learn how to get better.
I mean, had you like rolled it out to, a small group of salespeople?
Oh, no, we rolled it out to everybody.
You did all at once. Okay.
Yeah.
Do you think that's the right way, like looking back, or should you have gone a little bit more?
Yeah, probably maybe should have piloted it a little bit more.
Yeah. I mean, moving fast is what you have to do, right? So
well,
it's a balance.
So I think, it's funny. I kind of made the same mistake. Remember in the beginning, I sort of said, oh, go-to-market playbook is like having a good PowerPoint pitch, right? I kind of made that same mistake again, where it's like, okay, we got a broader platform, an ecosystem. I'm like, okay, we need a new pitch.
Yeah.
We rolled out the new pitch, and we're like, that
like
didn't
a
work.
Like pitch or something,
we had
right?
different competitors we were competing against. We're now selling. Like, there's different people inside the customer involved. Like, it required sort of a change in thinking.
Yeah. I feel like you almost need like a Davy Crockett-ish salesperson on that when you first roll out a new product, right?
That's a good question. Yeah, I think there were sort of early adopters in your own team that sort of naturally sort of try and take it. And I think that was, I'm sort of thinking about this on the fly because it wasn't just me. It was obviously had a product, had a marketing, everybody who's head of sales was involved in this. As we're in sort of alpha and beta and sort of all these new capabilities, it was really expanding our product platform. Yeah, there were people who were sort of that, essentially sort of the Davy Crockett's for sort of phase 2 of the company.
Yeah, they went out and talked to early customers, came back with early feedback in, yeah.
I think there's a macro point here, which is that, you can be really successful in Act 1 as a company. And it's hard to be successful just for Act 1. I think I underestimated as we were trying to make the transition to Act 2 for sort of the next version of what MobileIron was going to be, the broader story, the broader platform that drove our growth. I think I underestimated sort of the internal rewiring it took for our go-to-market playbook to be able to like change from Act 1 to Act 2. And I think if you look at sort of great companies, very rarely do they become great companies just on Act 1. It's usually Act 1 and Act 2 and even Act 3 that allow companies to become the $100 million, $200 million, $300 million a year really successful businesses. Very rarely is it just sort of whatever the one thing is that got them off the ground in the beginning.
Yeah, you kind of have to reinvent what you're offering. You have to reinvent how you're talking about it. And one thing we were talking about, before the podcast started is sort of fast-moving markets, right? Mm-hmm. And if you think about the mobile ecosystem 10 years ago, I mean, that's the epitome of like a really fast...
It was total chaos.
Yeah, exactly, right?
It was total chaos.
Yeah, Android
nobody knew how it was going to evolve.
Yeah, so I think you have a little bit of a framework for thinking about this. So I'd love to have you share how to find the market trends that if you want to keep calling it correctly the whole time, right? Because calling mobile in 2008 was a great call. Like, how did you call in the
but mobile
changes,
2010
right?
looked very different than 2008. Mobile 2012 looked very different than 2010. Yeah, that's a great topic. So this idea that like for companies to really become successful platform and long-term businesses, like there's an Act 1, Act 2, Act 3. So as a result, you kind of have to call the ball about what are these evolutions that happen in your market. Because if you're in a fast-moving dynamic market, it's going to evolve. And the trick is sort of how do you evolve with it and stay ahead and in front? And so how do you call the ball? I think one of the backstories for MobileIron that I don't think we probably really talked about is that we successfully called the ball like 5 or 6 times in a row for how the enterprise mobility market was going to evolve. Like enterprise mobility in 2008 was really different than 2010, 2011, 2012, 2013. Like it was a really fast moving market and we called the ball right a bunch of times in a row. So like part of that was probably luck, to be fair. But one of the things we did that I think really helped, and we just totally stumbled into this, by the way, so it wasn't like any sort of massive foresight, but we started doing this thing we called our market thesis. And just for context, every quarter we'd get together as a team offsite religiously. And I totally recommend that, by the way. Like, and things get really busy. It's going to be hard to do. Do it anyway.
How many days?
At least one day, sometimes 2.
Cool.
Offsite, goals, what's working well, what's not going well, how we doing, what are our goals for next quarter, and what are some big topics to talk about. Like, you just need quality time together as an executive team. And it's hard to do. Like, everybody's going to be really busy, including me, but we just had to be religious about it. And it was really painful sometimes, but I'm really glad we did it. And one of the things we would do at these offsites, not everyone, but probably like every other one, we do this thing called a market thesis, which sounds kind of boring, but turned out to be like really powerful. Basically what we do is like, I'd ask every one of the folks on my leadership team to go spend some time by themselves ahead of the meeting and write down what they think is going to happen in the market over the next 12 months. What's going to happen across customers, what's going to happen across product, what's going to happen across competition, what's going to happen across our ecosystem. And
so everybody goes separately.
Yeah, go do it themselves ahead of time, write it down, and we'd create like this 4-hour block during the offsite where everybody would basically present their piece to everybody else. Like one slide, right, with these like 4 sections on it. And everybody present everybody else. And what ended up happening is sometimes all of a sudden you'd see everybody kind of talking about the same thing and you're like, okay, wait a minute, that's like a big deal. Everybody's sort of seeing the same signal. Or sometimes you would see something come from one of the folks on the leadership team that nobody else had seen or heard about. We're like, wait a minute, tell us more about that. And all of a sudden we'd be like, oh my God, that's a really big deal. We got to totally like figure that out or get on that. I think in retrospect, it was a way to really pull out all the conscious and subconscious market signals, observations, customer conversations, internal conversations into sort of a way to like share it with everybody, and you could start to see the patterns. And a lot of the correct times for us calling the ball about what we needed to do next, and sometimes what we didn't need to do next, came out of those discussions. And like I said, it's sort of a boring name, market thesis, but I think that collective wisdom and sort of forcing that discussion in an organized way turned out to be one of our secret weapons for calling the ball right a bunch of times in a row.
Yeah, I love that. I mean, I'm probably guilty of going down the path of like being a little too top down, or working with my co-founder, just the two of us behind the closed door, trying to.
And then it's all on one person to synthesize it.
Yeah, exactly, right. And so I think really going to your team, having everyone do this, letting the, like, I mean, one, I think,
especially imagine it's like we're now like 200, 300, 400 people with like 1,000 customers. Like, it's like, and market's moving fast.
Yeah.
Like, being able to sort of synthesize this and figure out what to do was like, I suppose I could have just decided, or the product person decided, but like,
right.
It's probably not going to get to the right answer unless you just are a genius or lucky.
Crowdsource it; it's even better, right? You kind of come across these really smart people, and then everyone's more engaged with it because they helped build the market thesis. So,
and then because we were doing this in our offsite, the takeaways from that discussion often was very easy to then turn into goals for the team. Okay, well, as a result, what do we got to do as part of our goal planning for the next 6 months? Or, oh crap, we've got an issue we got to resolve. Like, let's figure that out. So it was very tightly tied to the, well, what do we then go do about it?
Mm-hmm.
Or what do we then not go do about it?
Sure. I want to kind of bring it back real quick to EnterpriseReady, right? Like, we have these features that we talk about, and it's interesting to think about, these set of common features that are never really going to be a wow, probably, right? But where do they fit in terms of this like company evolution? This between you're not doing an ideation phase. You're not like, well, we're going to have the best audit logs, right?
Specific killer features and capabilities that are very specific to your problem, which is why the customers buy your product. Exactly. But then there's a bunch of stuff that's like kind of table stakes,
right? Where do those fall in? Where should you be like thinking about adding those in? And where did you guys add them in at MobileIron? Like, maybe that's a good framework, but
yeah. So this is actually one of the hardest parts of being the head of product or engineering in a fast-growing technology company, is actually sort of making those trade-offs. And the way it ends up feeling is that very rarely is a customer going to buy your product for one of these enterprise-ready features like reporting or auditing or single sign-on or role-based access control. Like, no customer is going to be super excited about buying your product because they have that. It's all about the other stuff.
Right.
So in some ways, it's actually those
VoIP,
things
right? Yeah.
become the reason why somebody may not buy your product, or they may wait. But in the early days of a market and product, like, customers are willing to cut you some slack on that stuff, right? So, it's a tough trade, because what ends up happening is you have a limited amount of engineering resources, and you're like, all right, do we do A, B, and C to change the market? Do we A, B, and C to generate new revenue? Do we A, B, and C to change the customer conversation? Do we A, B, and C to compete better? Or do we A, B, and C to do something that nobody's going to talk about, but if we don't do it, maybe they won't buy?
Right?
Like, that's how it sort of manifests itself. And what ended up happening, and it was sort of came in fits and starts, is that periodically we'd sort of carve off a block of product energy and R&D energy to knock off sort of one of these enterprise features. Like, could be like, role-based access control. But it took us a long time to get to it.
Sure.
But, like once a year, we'd sort of carve off a block to say, all right, let's go knock off one of these things. It was one of the toughest jobs of being the head of product, was sort of balancing when to do that. And some of them probably took us 4 or 5 years to get to.
Oh, wow, really?
Yeah. And what's interesting is, like, it's a judgment call about, listening to your customers about what's really going to drive their purchase decision, and then what's really going to drive their adoption. And as long as you're listening to those things and factoring in correctly, that'll naturally sort of drive the prioritization of some of the unsexy but important enterprise-ready stuff.
Yeah, and I guess, to your point, I think this is also true. I talked to the segment founders. Sometimes there's just so much pull for your product. There's so much urgency that
you can get away with it.
Yeah, you just get away with it.
Customers are willing to give you a pass for a while.
Yeah. And, our thesis is always...
Or sometimes it's the size customer you're selling to, too, by the way. If you're
of course.
Mid-market, you get away with it if you're going to sell to Morgan Stanley.
Yeah, as soon as you're going into an enterprise, you need these features at some point. The one thing that I always think is a great point, too, to your point, you can get a pass on some of these features. Knowing what they are is really helpful. Being able to talk to them and say, like, yeah, we understand that you need role-based access control. Here's why you need it, right? And it's important to us that you be able to do that at some point, right? And say, obviously we think, currently, can you work around this in some way for a while before we have to build this in there? And you kind of can get that pass. 4 or 5 years, might be a long pass, but that's what it takes sometimes.
Yeah, I mean, in some ways, I think because of the speed and urgency around the evolution of the mobile market, there were so many other things changing, right? iOS came out, then Android came out, and the releases of software every year, and then, oh, wait, there's apps, there's content, there's entity. The rate of change of the market we were dealing with was absurd. And so just keeping up with the ecosystem changes was an enormous amount of energy, and customers actually told us, like, that's the most important part for us.
Right.
So I think in some ways we probably had a different experience than some companies because of the sheer sort of chaos and rapid evolution of the market. The most important thing to our customers was keep up with that.
Yeah, because it's just, there's a new OS that's coming out. We need to have support for it.
If you don't support it day one,
right.
like that's a real problem.
Yeah.
Like, that's like mission critical problem.
Yeah, so because of the speed at which anything underneath the hood was moving, they were willing to sacrifice in a few of those other features.
But, I think in some ways we probably waited too long on some of the enterprise-ready features. So I think, in retrospect, there's some that we would probably do differently and done earlier.
Any in particular that come to mind?
I think role-based access control took us longer than I think we thought. And, my one piece of advice for founders and really product folks thinking about some of these things is some enterprise-ready features have architectural implications, like role-based access control.
Right.
Some enterprise features, like reporting, don't.
Right.
So the ones that have architectural implications, it's important to sort of think about them earlier.
Yeah, at least to plan it out a little bit.
They get harder as time goes on.
Yeah, you end up accruing more technical debt over time as you don't have them because you need to get them in, and it's hard over a bigger code base. Yeah.
Yeah.
Reporting is one of those features though, that ends up sometimes, helping you sell, right?
Totally. Oh, yeah. Reporting is, in many ways how you manifest the value proposition for your product. And, there's tons of examples where reporting, you're like, oh, really? Is that sexy? Well, if you put yourself in the position of your customer, they've got to go to their boss to justify what they're doing. That is often what they show. The second thing that don't underestimate that I've seen a couple times with a couple companies is something that gets generated out of your product and report that gets used by your customer, they send upstream as part of their operational report. And if you, during a POC, can get one of your prospects to embed some of your report information in something they send up to their boss, the likelihood of them unhooking you after they've already started to send that information upstream gets lower and lower and lower. So reporting can actually be a very strategic part of getting embedded in your customer's operational workflow.
Yeah, that's a great point, because then the whoever they send it up to is going to ask for it again. And they're going to be like, well...
Oh, yeah, I decided not to send that to you now because I decided to say no to the product.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, but I want it back. So they'll re-implement everything just to get that one report back if their boss needs it, right?
Yeah, the trick is sort of knowing which ones those really are. I think you can go down a lot of rabbit holes about things you may think are important, but it really comes down to putting yourself in your customer's shoes, talking to them, watching them. What are they really sending upstream to really understand how do you make them the hero, right? That usually is what it comes down to, is how do you make your buyer or your decider a hero?
Yeah, that's so important. If they can get a promotion based on using your product, and that's part of what reporting does. It helps them give them, present things to up the stream to make them, more appreciate the work they're doing.
Totally. And I think every once in a while, you're part of a new category creation or a new problem that gets solved where your customers end up making their careers or get promoted on the backs of what have they learned how to do with you. And I think that's actually one of the more satisfying things about when I look back on, our 12,000 customers at MobileIron was that mobility was new. And there were a lot of our early customers that got promoted because they became the woman or the man that made mobility happen inside company A, B, or C, right? Or like at Marketo, like there were marketing managers that got promoted to CMO because they were the ones that made marketing analytical.
Sure.
Right? And in the early days of Cisco and networking, like the people who made the internet happen inside companies, became the CIO, right? So, don't underestimate the impact that you and your product and what you're helping your customers do can have on their careers. And, that's a very sort of profoundly satisfying impact you can have, not just on sort of your customers' businesses, but your customers' people and their careers.
Yeah, I mean, it kind of reminds me, we were talking a little bit before about like why you should build enterprise software companies, right? And I think a lot of it's because like we spend so much time at work, right? And you can really impact people's lives. This is in a really profound way. 40 to 80 hours a week we're doing these things. So, and I think you have some perspective on like some other reasons why and some opportunities you see changing. I'd love to hear.
Yeah. So, it's funny. I've been doing enterprise tech since since 1992. And for a long time, it was sort of considered pretty uncool.
Oh, it's so cool
like
now.
Consumer was like so much cooler. What I love about doing enterprise and sort of B2B stuff is that if you look what's happening right now, like the entire enterprise tech stack is getting reinvented. Like, I mean, obvious stuff like the transition from prem to cloud, right? But like, that's a huge change.
Yeah.
Right? The entire app stack is getting transformed from sort of traditional client server to web-based models to now container-based models. Identity is being completely rethought. Internet of Things is changing sort of how people think about connectivity. Like just there's so many things that are just in the process of getting completely reinvented. Then you layer on things like AI and ML. So, it's a multi-trillion-dollar industry where a huge chunk of it's actually getting reinvented over the next 10 years. And I think that's cool.
Yeah.
And there's a great opportunity to build so many great businesses in there and, really make a difference, in our customers' businesses. And, like you said, we all spend a big chunk of our life at work. So, if we can help make those businesses and the people inside those companies' jobs a little easier, a little better, more productive, more effective, that's adding value to the world.
I love it. And Bob, I know that you're sort of working on your next book, right? Which is about
Change or Be Changed.
Yeah, the evolution, in the role of CEO. I'd love to just close out by letting you kind of like talk for a few minutes about what does that mean to you, and tell us about the thesis behind it.
Like frustration is often the mother of inspiration. One of the things that I think for enterprise entrepreneurs, just entrepreneurs everywhere, that is hard is as your company changes and grows, your job changes, and therefore you have to change. Or frankly, you get changed. And so I think there's like this silent struggle that we all face continuously, which is how do we keep up with our company? And, for me, sort of how that felt was, over the course of 5 years, we went from, me and like 20 other people kind of trying to build a product that people cared about to 500, 600 people doing $100 million a year thinking about going public. Like, that was a crazy 5 years. And over that period of time, I think one of the things I didn't appreciate is that as the company changed, my CEO job changed. And for my leaders, their job changed. And for their teams, their job changed. And for my board, their jobs changed. I don't think we spend enough time or there's not a lot of institutional knowledge passed down about how as companies changes, people's jobs change and they have to change themselves. It sort of gets thrown around in these memes like, go scale. It's like, what does that mean? Nobody knows what to do with that. So my core lesson on this was unlearning, which is the irony is the things that I think, help make me successful is like, the 0 to 50 person CEO trying to find product market fit kind of got in my way becoming the CEO of the whole company, trying to unlock growth. And then things that may be successful there got in my way at the next level. And so we spend a lot of time talking about what we need to learn, and I think that's important, but I don't think we spend enough time talking about what we need to unlearn. And like for me as CEO, like the first CEO job felt kind of like Captain America or Wonder Woman with the platoon in the woods. It's like you're throwing punches, digging ditches, getting dirty, like it's a blast. Right? But then the second CEO job was more like the Avengers, where it's like you have to hire a band of superheroes, each of which who has a better superpower than you. And you have to let go, otherwise they're not going to come work for you, they're going to quit. And you're hiring somebody that's better at sales than you, and marketing than you, and product than you, and sales than you. Of course, that's the right answer. But what's the first thing they do when they come in? They look at all the stuff you worked so hard to build and be like, that stinks. Right? So this change from being sort of the CEO in the platoon in the woods, Captain America, Wonder Woman to the Avengers is a hard transition. Like the things that actually make you successful being the jack of all trades, you have to unlearn because you got to let go and let your team do it. And then at about 400 people, the CEO job changed again to be more like Professor X, Professor Xavier and the X-Men, where you're like the dean of a university and your teachers are your warriors bringing up the next generation. And I had to do a lot fewer things, but for a lot more people. And I had to repeat myself over and over and over and over and over and over and over again, which drove me absolutely bananas. Like, I really struggled with that transition. And I think it was because in sort of the Avenger stage, I was like, well, we talked about this. We decided, move on. But the job when you're 500 people as CEO is part of your job is to be a signal generator, to keep everybody aligned on the mission and the goals and doing. And guess what? That takes repetition. So suck it up, Bob. That's actually part of the job. But I kind of got in my own way and was like judging myself saying that's non-value added work, because I was applying sort of my filter and my value added equation that I had sort of developed in sort of the middle phase of like the Avengers to the Professor Xavier phase. And I had to unlearn that. And I think, this applies to every leader, right? Sales leaders go from Davy Crockett to more like Braveheart to more like Eisenhower, going from fighting on the battlefield to fighting from the war room.
Sure.
Every leadership job goes through these sort of same changes where what got you from A to B is going to either hold you back or kill you going from B to C. So you actually have to unlearn. And, on one level, it's a very uncomfortable process. It triggers a lot of insecurity because you have to kind of let go of the things you're comfortable with. And even the way you sort of feel like you add value. So there's these weird emperor has no clothes moments. But it's also sort of a spectacular personal growth opportunity and learning opportunity that, at least for me, I think kind of made me a better person, actually. It's sort of like those big, gnarly things in life, like having kids, right? It's sort of illogical. It's hard. You don't get much sleep. It's kind of messy. But on the other side, it's sort of like, I'm a better person for it. Like,
that's cool.
Going through these same types of things professionally, I think has the same type of impact. But doesn't mean it's easy. So that's what book 2 is about. It's called Change or Be Changed. It's orderable on Amazon now. And the theme is unlearning.
Cool. That's I love that topic. I feel like we fill our lives with, podcasts and YouTube videos and books we're reading and everything else to try to constantly add more information, right? And it's hard to, you're right, you rarely think about like, what do you need to unlearn and stop doing and do differently in order to advance, right? Because you can't keep everything in your mind all the time. And you sort of have to make space for new,
And new behaviors, new knowledge, and means sort of not doing things the way you used to do them. And it's hard. It's much more counterintuitive and sort of insecurity generating that I think I thought going into it.
Because you're like, well, I'll just keep doing the same things that have made me successful. I'll just keep going.
Which is natural reflex, particularly under duress, by the way.
Yeah, exactly. Well, who has duress, right? No.
Yeah, exactly.
Founders, no.
Well, that's sort of the funny thing. The book series we called Survival to Thrival.
Right.
Because in the beginning, like starting a company is sort of where you guys are, right? It's like your main mission is just don't die.
Right, always.
Right. But then at some point, when you find go-to-market fit and start to unlock this repeatable growth, then it becomes about how do you win? And ironically, the very things that you do in the don't die phase now kind of get in your way when you're like, how do we win phase? And yes, we do know thrival is not a real word.
It's a great word. We'll get it in there eventually.
It's phonetically consistent, if not grammatically correct.
It's perfect. Bob, thank you so much. I really appreciate all your time. This is amazing. I'm very excited to check out the new book, and hopefully everyone will read the first book as well. So.
Yeah, and best of luck to all the entrepreneurs and folks out there doing the hard work. Sometimes it's lonely, but you're not alone. We've all been through it, and we'll all continue to go through it as part of the journey.
That's all we have time for today. If you're interested in being a guest on this show, or if you'd like to suggest a topic, or just to learn more about enterprise features, find us at EnterpriseReady.io. To learn more about Heavybit, visit heavybit.com to check out the library. It's packed with amazing talks on sales, marketing, product, and general management from founders of developer tools companies and other industry leaders.